Welcome everybody to CSIS. I'm Jennifer Cook, Director of the Africa Program here at CSIS. And we're really delighted to have today Sebastian Elischer and David Throop to talk about how jihadism ends, comparing state strategies toward violent extremism in Kenya and Uganda. Radicalization and violent extremism derive from a whole complex interplay of social, political, historical factors with an overlay of religious ideology or the language of jihad that is often used to kind of mobilize militancy. The drivers are complex, and so states are kind of grappling with how best to respond and how to prioritize those responses. CSIS a couple years ago had a major project on political and state institutions in Africa. We took 5 case studies looking at how religious institutions and religious actors have helped shape the political space, looking back historically and in current day as states have democratized and as public space opens, how have religious institutions played in that space? We were very fortunate to have Sebastian Elischer do the case study on Niger in that, and Niger's in the news, so you've got a good source here for that. And David Throop do the piece on Kenya. The other countries were Senegal, Uganda, and Nigeria. We're currently in a second project, this is funded by the Luce Foundation, looking at how states are responding to the challenge of radicalization. For the purposes of our project, we're looking at state responses through the education system, through regulation of religious institutions and of speech, through de-radicalization programs where they exist in prisons and so forth, and then through diplomacy. How are states managing external influences, religious influences? So that's our project, and fortunately, Sebastian is doing very similar work at the University of Florida, where he is an assistant professor of political science. He has published widely on the relationship between institutions and ethnic and religious identities in sub-Saharan Africa, writing on ethnicity and party formation in Africa. That was his first book. And currently writing a book examining the relationship between 6 West and East African states and conservative Sunni communities. We also have David Throop, who will be respondent, talking about David has been a long time senior associate of the Africa program. He's a historian. Anybody who knows Kenya probably knows David Throop's work. He's an encyclopedia of knowledge. And as I said, authored our piece, a very good piece on the relationship between state and religious institutions in Kenya. What we're going to do is have Sebastian talk a little bit about his forthcoming paper and some of the research he's done on that, have David respond, and then we hope for a good interactive discussion that I hope can help inform our larger project as well. So Sebastian, thanks so much for coming, and David as well. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. A very good morning to everyone, and a big thank you to Jennifer and CSIS for facilitating this conversation today. My presentation examines the evolution of the relationship between the state and the Islamic sphere in Kenya and Uganda. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the consequences who are politically active and who are active in the religious sphere, but who do not constitute a security threat. Because of these constant and very institutionalized interactions between the state and the Islamic sphere and the Salafi communities, the Ugandan state was able to distinguish between the Islamic sphere in general and the violent minority within that sphere. And this meant that the security forces targeted the Jihadi Salafi subgroup much more effectively. That's a very different situation in Kenya, which failed to create institutional mechanisms linking the Islamic sphere to the state. The Kenyan state consistently failed to engage with its Salafi minority in a constructive manner, and it has consistently resorted to indiscriminate violence against the Islamic sphere as a whole. And therefore, I argue that the Ugandan state was a demobilizer of jihadi Salafism, whereas the Kenyan state inadvertently became a main radicalizer of the Salafi minority. How does institutional regulation work in areas in which state bureaucracies and state administrations are notoriously weak and underperforming? Well, I argue that it works through national Islamic associations. It works through the delegation of state authority to non-state actors, in this case, Islamic clerics. Uganda, in the early 1970s, formed a state-led Islamic association, the Ugandan Muslim Supreme Council. It was formed by Idi Amin, so it was formed on the initiative of the Ugandan state. The Amin government forced all existing Islamic associations to unite under the roof of a new association. And the state delegated the authority to restrict access to the religious sphere to Sufi leaders at the time. So the UMSC became responsible for the nomination of imams in Friday prayer mosques, and the UMSC held the property rights to all Ugandan Friday prayer mosques. And this effectively created a monopoly in the Islamic sphere. I want to highlight here that this is deeply autocratic, okay? And Idi Amin didn't do so because he was terribly concerned about Jihadi Salafism, of course. Jihadi Salafism is something that emerges in the mid-1990s. This council served a political purpose. And Idi Amin very much took the lessons of how he ascended to power through the manipulation of religious communities. And he didn't want this to happen to him. So I want to be very clear here that this is an autocratic mechanism of controlling the religious sphere. That was very different in Kenya. Kenya also created a national Islamic association at around the same time, which is the Supreme Council of Kenyan Muslims. SUPCAM was formed on the initiative of Saudi Arabia. It was formed on the initiative of foreign clerics, and the Kenyan state went along with it. The Kenyan state went along with it because it didn't care about the Islamic sphere, because Islam in Kenya is concentrated or located on the political fringes of Kenya. It's located in what used to be the Northern Frontier District and later became Northeastern Province, and what for a long time was the Coastal Province. Islam did not play a role or was not a factor in the ethnic alliances that were responsible for running politics in Nairobi. The Kenyan state recognized SUPCAM as the official voice of Islam in Kenya, but it didn't engage with this body. SUPCAM always operated independently of the state. There have always been hundreds of Islamic associations coexisting with SUPCAM. So in Kenya, the religious market was open for a long period of time. And this had visible consequences for the composition of the religious landscapes in the 1970s and 1980s. So in Uganda, we see autocratic regulation of religious activity, and the UMSC is a Sufi-run organization. and the nascent Salafi community in Uganda found it virtually impossible to establish a viable presence. And I had many conversations with contemporary Salafi clerics in Kampala and elsewhere, and they all say we had nowhere to go in the 1970s and 80s. We had some clerics around who tried to build up a viable community, but because we were effectively shut out of the Friday prayer mosques, it was very autocratic. We could not practice our faith. Okay? That's a sentence that came up time and time again. Kenya really experienced the dramatic transformation of its religious landscape in the 1970s in particular, to the advantage of the Salafi communities. If you do research on who the chief Qadi was in Kenya throughout the 70s and 1980s, almost all candidates were Salafi clerics. What really changes the situation in Uganda is the expulsion of the Asian community and the downfall of the Amin government. The deportation of Ugandan Asians frees up religious space. And the end of the Amin period leads to a period in which the UMSC lacks guidance from the state. Almost all Salafi Friday prayer mosques in Uganda are mosques that were previously held by the Asian community. In particular, Nakasero Mosque in Kampala, which is the unofficial headquarters of the Salafi community. So it was the deportation, the forceful deportation of Asian Ugandans, and the downfall of the Amin government, which allows the Salafi communities to capture these mosques, and strictly speaking, illegally. Okay? By the mid-1980s, the Salafi community in Uganda had established a visible minority presence in Kampala, and it starts to grow rapidly, and the community becomes particularly popular amongst young people in Uganda. In 1989 and 1991, the Salafi youth, as they're known as the time, or the Tabligh movement, occupy the headquarters of the UMSC, and this is really the first time the Ugandan state is confronted by Salafi agitation. This is not Jihadi Salafism. Okay? This is Salafi agitation. The Salafi want to have a seat on the religious table, if you want to. They want to become members of the UMSC. They decry the UMSC as Sufi-led, as corrupt, as run by the government. And the Ugandan state reacts by consulting with them, and by consulting with the UMSC. The Salafi youth movement is invited to come to the presidency, and Museveni sits down and he's having a conversation with them. And the state now legalizes their presence. And essentially there are a lot of deals that are being made. And the deal Museveni is putting to them is, okay, I'm going to throw money at you. You can become part of the UMSC, but that's on the condition that you confine your activities to the religious sphere. Okay? So there is a lot of co-optation going on. Okay? So the Museveni government effectively co-opts mainstream or non-violent Salafis and is providing them with a space. And that effectively creates a division within the Salafi community between those who want to go along with the state and those who can be labeled radical or violent. And the leaders of what becomes later the Allied Democratic Forces are those leaders which wouldn't go along with the 1991 compromise. But what takes place in Uganda at an early stage is a division of the Salafi community between those who accept the state and those who don't. In Kenya, assertive Salafism really manifests itself in the early 1990s with the formation of the Islamic Party of Kenya, which as a whole is not a Salafi party, but it is led by clerics who would today identify as Salafi. Okay? It's wrong to argue the IPK is a Salafi party, but its leaders, its spiritual leaders, are. The state reaction to the formation of this political party is not consultation or co-optation, it's indiscriminate violence. And much has been written about these early elections in Kenya, among them David Thorpe. and the state reacts by deploying its security apparatus. And it doesn't just crack down on those clerics that run the APK, they crack down on Mombasa and on other centers of Islamic activity. And what this does is it leads to a deep sense of alienation, not just amongst Salafis, but amongst Muslim Kenyans in general. Jihadi Salafism then begins to affect Uganda, as I said before, in the mid-1990s, by two groups, and as I already alluded to, both were led by those clerics, which did not go along in the 1991 compromise. And what we see in those years is really very close cooperation between the Museveni government, the UMSC, and those Salafi clerics which went along in 1991. And what these groups and what the government is doing, they try and undermine recruitments in Friday prayer mosques. And I conducted a lot of interviews with former ADF fighters in Uganda. And again, what they were telling me is we had nowhere to recruit in Uganda. We had nowhere to recruit in Kampala. It was very, very difficult for us to recruit people that could be turned into jihadi rebels, because the state was omnipresent, the state had co-opted Islamic leaders, and it was difficult for our sympathizers to find a recruitment ground. And that's one of the reasons why early on the ADF and the UNFMA were forced to cooperate outside of Uganda, and much of the war between the Ugandan state and jihadis was fought in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In 2000, Uganda passes an amnesty law, and that amnesty law really was designed to deal with other kind of jihadis, Christian jihadis. Okay, the amnesty law really grew out of the necessity to end the war between the Ugandan states and other rebels in Uganda's north. But what this amnesty law does is it really undermines rebel recruitment elsewhere, because the Ugandan state becomes very active to advertise this amnesty program, which allows former rebels to come out of the bush and to become productive members of Ugandan societies again. Okay? This effectively ends jihadi Salafism in Uganda, which is not to say that there isn't a threat out there, but as the quantitative data shows you, it's a considerably lower threat. In Kenya, what we see throughout the 1990s and early 2000s is the radicalization of many Salafi mosques on the coast and northeastern province. And the reason why this occurs, or one of many reasons why this occurs, is the Kenyan state lacks allies in the Islamic sphere. There were two Salafi associations in Kenya that formed in the mid-1990s. The Council for the Imams and Preachers of Kenya and the National Muslim Leader Forum, the CIPK, and NAMLEF. In recent years, what have happened, especially during the Kenyatta presidency, is that clerics affiliated with these associations really issue calls for help, especially on the coast. And they call on the Kenyan government to do something about the growing radicalization of their followers. And many of you might have noticed that 2 years ago there was a lot of press coverage about the killing of Muslim clerics on Kenya's coast. Those were all clerics affiliated with the CIPK and NAMLEF who were killed by their own followers. And a lot of clerics on the coast in Kenya told me, basically, we can expect one of two things. We're either going to get killed in a security raid by the Kenyan security forces, or we're going to get killed by our own radicalized youth. That's exactly what happened between 2013 and today on Kenya's coast. The Kenyan state did not react to these calls for help. Instead, Uhuru Kenyatta gave various speeches on the coast saying Kenyan Islam is Sufi Islam. Okay? And whenever there has been a terrorist attack in Mombasa or in Nairobi, there has been, just like in the early 1990s, either ignorance or there has been an indiscriminate crackdown on the Muslim community as a whole. And this has fostered the further radicalization of Muslim youth in the northeast, in Nairobi, and in what used to be coastal province. The discrimination of Kenyan Muslims also manifests itself in a variety of other aspects in politics. Much has been written about this. Arbitrary detention, the fact that Muslim citizens do not have easy access to IDs, to university scholarships, the crackdown on Muslim civil society on the coast, all this contributes to the further alienation, and it fosters radicalization. To finish, I want to talk a little bit about the implications. What my research shows, and that's not just research in East Africa, but that's research that I've conducted in, as Jennifer said, 6 African countries now, is what is an effective strategy, a strategy even a weak state can pursue. It's a strategy of soft regulation. I said this before, the UMSC has very autocratic origins. It was formed by Idi Amin for political purposes. And that's not a policy recommendation I would put forward, okay? But what I would argue is there is need to establish strong linkages between the state, the Islamic community, and the Salafi community. In every single African country in which I've conducted research, where these links exist, there is considerably less exposure to jihadi ideology. Okay? So soft regulation or cooperation combined with consultation and cooptation is an effective strategy, okay? In the sense that it's something states can contribute to. Okay? It shouldn't be the only strategy, but it can be a useful one. Indiscriminate force in every single country in which I worked in has led to further radicalization. To some extent or another, what we see happening in Africa today with regard to the Salafi community is very much an outcome of political decisions that African leaders made in the 1970s. Many scholars argue that the early 1990s led to the liberalization of the political landscape and hence to changes in the religious landscape. I partly disagree with this. I think it's much more important what happens in Africa in the early 1970s prior to the onset of Saudi Arabia as a main exporter of the Salafi creed. And that's important because policymaking does not take place in a vacuum. Policymakers need to know what is the position of Islam, what is the position of Salafism vis-à-vis the government in these countries. Having said that, if you study the political dynamics of Kenya and you compare that to the political dynamics of Uganda, you will notice that co-optation, soft manipulation, if you want to really characterize a lot of what Museveni does. Violence, ethnic and religious exclusion really characterize or have characterized Kenyan politics since independence. And it seems that the strategies African countries pursue in the Islamic sphere resemble overarching strategies that their leaders pursue in the political sphere in general. The question to which state strategy in the religious sphere can be standalone strategies and can be separated from the general dynamics is questionable. And I would argue that there is also a bit of grim news or bad news for policymakers. Okay? Because again, it doesn't take place in a vacuum. It's part of a much broader political culture. Thanks.
Thank you, Sebastian. That was really useful to go into the history of that. And I have some questions, but I'll wait and turn to David Throop for comments, additions, rebuttals.
Thank you very much. I found that fascinating, and I think I can say that I agree with every word of it. But my conclusion is, so what? Does it really make a difference? And I think not. I think that to a certain extent, if you look at Islam in Uganda and you look at Islam in Kenya, you are really looking at two very different phenomena, and you are looking at societies in which the Muslim population have very, very different positions. And some of that you said. So if we take Uganda to start off with, Islam in Uganda dates back about 150 years. It's a creation of long-distance trade in pre-colonial societies, of merchants coming down the Nile Valley from Khartoum through Equatoria, it's now South Sudan, into the Akoli and Lango areas of what is now Uganda, and on to the kingdoms of Bunyoro, Kitara, and Buganda. There was a second route, perhaps a more important route, from Zanzibar across what is now central Tanzania into the Maniema territory of the Congo, and an offshoot up the west bank of Lake Victoria into or through Ankoli and Toro into Buganda and Bunyoro, Kitara. Those trade routes started in the 1820s, 1830s. They became, I think, significant in the 1860s, in 1870s. The northern trade route was disrupted by the Mahdiya in the 1880s, but the southern trade route continued to grow. And by the 1880s, you had in Buganda the emergence of an important, even quite substantial, elite of Muslim converts. And in 1888, they staged a coup d'etat, what historians call the Muslim Revolution of 1888. What they wanted to do was to modernize the Bugandan state, to bureaucratize it, to promote trade, to facilitate the further expansion of Islam. I think you can draw a very clear parallel with the Islamic Jihad of Uthman Dan Fodio in 1804 in northern Nigeria, leading to the creation of the Sokoto Caliphate. Uthman Dan Fodio succeeded in the early 19th century. The Buganda Muslims failed at the end of the 19th century. And what they did was to trigger a decade of civil war, which first of all saw the Muslims pitted against the traditionalists and the Christians. And then there was the second phase, which saw the traditionalists pitted against the Christians. And then the final phase was the Anglicans pitted against the Roman Catholics. And by 1900, because of these processes, Islam had spread fairly widely throughout Uganda. Islam in Uganda is as strong, and I would argue perhaps even stronger, in the core parts of the modern Ugandan state rather than in the periphery. If you think of the Akoli region, if you think of the West Nile region, probably the most important religious phenomenon there are the Anglicans, not Islam. Islam is heavily present, 14–15% of the population, in Buganda. Islam is at the very core of the Ugandan polity, in a sense. It's not identified with particular ethnic communities. It's not marginalized on the periphery. And given the sectarian nature of Ugandan politics during the colonial era, and indeed for the first quarter of a century after independence, the Muslim population played an important interstitial role in Ugandan politics, offering to support, on the one hand, the Anglicans, on the other hand, the Roman Catholics. Uganda was a very polarized, a very sectarian society. And the Muslims were the intermediaries, the interlocutors between the rival Christian groups. Now, we all think of Idi Amin as a Muslim president of Uganda, but we forget there's a second one, Yusuf Lule, And Lule's career, I think, is fascinating because it highlights the fundamental distinctions between Ugandan Islam and Kenyan Islam. So Lule was a star student at Makerere in the 1930s, star student in South Africa in the late 1930s, early 1940s. After training in South Africa and Britain, he comes back to Uganda as a lecturer in medicine at the university, Makerere University College, in the late 1940s, 1950s, become professor, as well as working at the Makerere University Hospital. From 1964 to 1970, he's the principal, the boss of the university. And then in 1970, he's elected General Secretary of the Association of African Universities and goes off to Accra. By the late 1970s, he's the consensual leader, figurehead, of the Ugandan resistance to Idi Amin. And in 1979, briefly, he becomes the second Muslim president of Uganda. He's dumped not because he's a Muslim, but because he's a Muganda. Now, I can't think of any Kenyan who occupied so prominent a position as an intellectual, as a scientist, as a university administrator, and as a politician drawn from the Kenyan Muslim community. I cannot think in particular of any Kikuyu Muslim that would occupy the position that Lule did as a Baganda Muslim. And it seems to me that Islam in Uganda is spread much more widely throughout society. It's maybe only 12, 13, 14% of the population. But it is accepted as a legitimate expression of religious belief. They have played an interstitial role in the politics of Uganda. They are not peripheral to the Ugandan polity. They are normal Ugandans. And that seems to me a fundamental difference from Kenya, where Islam is strange. Islam is peculiar. Islam is, to a certain extent, semi-subversive. Or that's what many upcountry Kenyans might think. So if we switch to Kenya now, Islam in Kenya is entirely different. Islam in Kenya dates back 1,000 years. The earliest mosques in Kenya date back to the 9th and 10th century. By the 12th and 13th century, the coastal cities, towns of Kenya were an integral part of Muslim monsoon Indian Ocean society and trade, linking the western shores of India, Persia, the Persian Gulf, Arabia, and East Africa. And yet Kenyan Islam, or Islam that was in those areas which are now Kenya, was never really able to expand. It was never able to diversify. It was never able to become part of upcountry Kenya. And that's because of the environment, the structure of Kenya. Anybody who is driven from Mombasa to Nairobi will know what I mean. You go through 20 miles of fertile coast, then you go up the escarpment onto the plain, and then you have 280 very boring miles of sparsely populated, arid landscape, virtually to the outskirts of Nairobi. It was very, very difficult in pre-colonial times, before the construction of the railroad, to advance into the interior of Kenya. It used to take about 6 weeks in the 1890s for British expeditions to move out from Mombasa to get to the Central Highlands. You certainly couldn't get to Uganda because if you got as far as the Central and went down into the Rift Valley, you had another blockage. You had the Maasai. the great military power of 18th, 19th century East Africa, which blocked trade connections. So Islam in Kenya remained a function of the coast. It remained a function of Somalia. And if we look at the nationalist movement in Kenya is dominated by upcountry politicians. If by the 1940s you think of 4 prominent coastal political figures, they're all Christian. One thinks of Jimmy Jeremiah, the first African from the coast on the Legislative Council. One thinks of Clements Kadali, the leader of the African Workers' Federation and organizer of the 1947 Mombasa strike. One thinks of Dennis Akumu and the dock workers in the 1950s. One thinks of Ronald Ngala, the Kadu leader of the late 1950s. All of them are Christians. 2 of them, Clements Kadali is a Kikuyu and Dennis Akumu is a Luo, are upcountry migrants. So you have a very different matrix. There are very few prominent politicians from the coastal regions. The coast was semi-detached. The British recognized that. The official British name for Kenya was the Colony and Protectorate of Kenya. The coastal strip from the Tana River down to the Tanganyikan border was the Protectorate. And it wasn't part of the colony. It wasn't part of Kenya proper. It was the territory of the Sultanate of Zanzibar. And alongside the British Provincial Commissioner, you had a Zanzibari Liwali for the coast. Alongside the district commissioners for Kwale, Mombasa, Kilifi, you had a local Zanzibari Liwali. You had a condominium of power. And in the late 1950s, early 1960s, you had a strong movement for maintaining the relationship with Zanzibar, particularly among the Arab community. And among the wider community at the coast, you had support for Majimbo, for coastal autonomy. The coast wasn't really part of Kenya. It took 12 hours by car, 14 hours by train to get from Nairobi to Mombasa. The coast was a different world. It operated on different principles. And Islam was perceived, quite rightly, I think, as primarily a coastal phenomenon. Somalia area is even more problematic, even less part of Kenya. The Brits transferred the boundary in 1923, giving Jubaland to the Italians. In 1947-48, the Brits talked about creating a big Somalia, which would carve off the northern frontier and incorporate it into Somalia. That was vetoed by the Americans on the behalf of the Ethiopians, didn't want to lose the Ogaden. And then in 1961, there was a referendum on the future of the Somali areas of Kenya, which voted 85% to join Somalia. Now, it wasn't the British who failed to follow through. It was the African politicians in Nairobi, the leaders of the nationalist movement, who did not want to see a chunk of Kenya given away.
Okay, let's move towards the independence
From 63
period.
to 69, you have the war, the shift to war between Somalia and Kenya over the Somali populated areas of Kenya. And you have villagization, you have shoot-to-kill policies, you have 23-hour curfews. So, you know, the Somali area is different. And we forget now, we all think when political detainees under Kenyatta, first Kenyatta, we think of the KPU, we think of Oginga Odinga, Bilder Kagea. But in fact, throughout the 1960s, 1970s, the largest number of detainees in Kenya were Somali irredentists fighting for the future. So Islam has had a very special case. It's also being fragmented in Kenya to a much greater extent than in Uganda. So throughout the 1960s, 1970s, into the 1980s, most imams of Friday prayer mosques were Arabs. They had an almost complete monopoly of mosques in Kenya. The financial wherewithal for the operation of the Friday prayer mosques came mainly from the Asian community, from Punjabis. If you look at the board of directors, the business committees of Friday prayer mosques throughout that period, they're heavily Asian. It's the Asian community that coughed up the money. And yet the congregations were the Mijikenda, the Swahili, the Bajuni, the Somali, the Orma, the indigenous African populations. I think that when SUPKEM was created, it reflected those divisions. It was the best, really, that could be constructed in this divided Islamic society. And I think it performed a useful role in the 70s and 80s. The problem with SUPKEM is that it became too identified with KANU. If you look at the chairman of SUPKEM in the 70s and 80s, they're all middle-level Kenyan coastal Somali politicians, all assistant ministers, incumbent members of parliament, and in the 1990s, people like Sharif Nasir, the Mombasa KANU chairman and assistant minister for tourism. There was a very close linkage between SUPKEM and the single-party state. When that disintegrated in the late 1980s, 1990s, SUPKEM lost its authority, and you get the rise to the Congress, the Council of Imams and Preachers and NAMLEF and so on, as the steering organization. I don't really think Kenyan could have done any better. But if we look at the causes of jihadi, it's not that SUPKEM failed to control them. It's that there are acute social grievances in Kenyan society. You have the land issue among the Mijikenda, particularly the Digo in Kwale. You have land issues, the conflict between the Orma and Pokomo in Tana River. You have the increasing Kikuyuization of Lamu district. Lamu at the 2009 census was 39% Kikuyu. It's probably going by 2030 to be the first Kikuyu majority county at the coast. It's already got a majority of Kikuyu people living in Mpakatoni division. The development of the port of Lamu, the possible development of the Lapsset corridor in northern Kenya is going to exacerbate those problems, intensify local Bajuni social grievances, and lead to further support for al-Hijra and al-Shabaab. You've got the Somalis, I won't say very much, 3 divisions, the indigenous Somalis. The masses have done very badly, the elite have done very well. One of the great successes in Kenya over the last 30 years is the incorporation of the Somali elite into the political and economic nation. The first Kenyan cabinet minister who was a Muslim was the Somali in 1983. Now we've had a member of the Supreme Court, we've had the police commissioner, we've had the chairman of the Electoral Commission, we have the current foreign minister, we have the director of national security. All of these are prominent Somalis occupying key positions in the Kenyan state. You've also got al-Dadaab and the UN High Commission for Human Rights. And you also have illegal immigrants into Kenya from Somalia. Each of those have about 1.25 million people, each block. The Kenyan state hasn't really been able to grapple with the social and economic problems of coastal Kenya and the northeast. It sees resistance, it sees opposition in those areas through the prism of state security. And it has been very brutal and has actually incited recruits for al-Hijra. I'll finish by throwing the firecracker into the fireworks. And that is, in the 1980s, 1990s, there was quite significant conversion to Islam in non-traditional parts of Kenya, non-traditional Muslim parts of Kenya. And it was fundamentally the collapse of the state school system in the 1980s, 1990s, under pressure from structural adjustment, which saw the establishment in Central Province, in Western Province, in Nyanza, in the Rift Valley, of Muslim madrasa, which taught discipline. They taught basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. And you saw the conversion of not large numbers, but a significant number of individuals among the Kikuyu, the Kalenjin, the Abaluya, the Luo, to Islam. So if you go to a place like Eldoret, there are hundreds of mosques now in Eldoret, whereas 40 years ago, there were maybe one or two. We have had a transformation. And what is significant is that the leadership of Al-Hijra, the Al-Shabaab faction inside Kenya, is no longer drawn from the Somali. It's no longer drawn from the Mijikenda and the traditional Muslim peoples of the coast. It's drawn from these new upcountry Muslim converts. And the Kenyan government either doesn't recognize that or doesn't know how to get its head around the problem. But it seems to me that what is engendering jihadi Islam, the violent version, in Kenya, is not the failure to institutionalize control of Salafist teaching in Kenya, but of the very real social, economic, and political grievances of the people at the coast, and indeed of people in other parts of Kenya, who in the 1980s, 1990s were attracted to Islam as an expression of order, as an institution which would enable them to find their place in Kenyan society. That, to me, is the fundamental problem, rather than the network of associations and controls policing the mosques. I think SUPKEM has done well, and well, certainly did well for the first 20 years, even if it had been a tight institution, which I think it was impossible to create in the Kenyan context. The political events of the last quarter of a century would have led it to collapse. It wouldn't have worked. Whereas in Uganda, if you had had a weak institution, I think it would more or less have performed effectively. If Idi Amin hadn't autocratically merged the Baganda and the non-Baganda Muslim organizations in Uganda, they would have muddled through. And the problem is the fundamental different nature and the fundamental different social grievances that rest behind radical Islam in Uganda and Kenya.
Great. Thank you. I'm probably not great at timekeeping, but I'm fascinated by that history, which I think is so important to understand. On your last point, though, I wonder if it's less kind of the regulation of mosques and so forth that Sebastian was talking about, and more the idea of engaging and building allies within the Salafi community that Uganda did.
That's a fair point.
The other contrast I think that I would, that strikes me is that Kenya is being a much more open society. I think, in the 90s, there was an East African al-Qaeda cell. There have been external influences that have come in and kind of built out local allies in a way that I don't know that was done with the kind of overt recruitment that was done in Kenya versus Uganda. They also brought, and maybe you can correct me on the tactics of the ADF, but the explicit targeting of very soft targets and civilians. I'm not sure, you can talk a little bit about ADF tactics and so forth, but it was a kind of an anti-state movement in some ways. versus, you know, a university campus or a mall, for example. So those are the two, that Kenya is more open. There have been more kind of external influences and active recruitment. But I think you can maybe answer those, and we'll turn it open for broader questions and comments.
So I'll keep my responses very brief, because it's not that there is a disagreement here about sort of dynamics or facts. There is, I guess, differences here to the extent to which we weight factors or state responses. I'm just going to say the story you're telling here about Ugandan Islam being much more united, that story doesn't hold up. If you research the developments within Ugandan Islam in the 1960s and 70s, to say that it was so much more orderly than in Kenya and that Ugandan Muslims are so much more united, that does not stand the test of scrutiny. But I don't want this to turn into a historian's debate, but I feel that you talked up a little bit the unity in the Ugandan Islamic sphere.
In fact, are there not two rival mosques?
Well, there are more than two rival mosques. Also, Western historiography on Islam in Uganda portrays it as, bipolarity, whereas in fact there are 5 to 7 associations. So, but it really doesn't matter here. I mean, the question is, how much do you believe in institutions and how much do you believe in history? And do you think that there always is a deterministic outlook? Because when I was listening to you, David, it was very reminiscent of what people were saying in the 1980s about democracy in Eastern Europe and democracy in Africa, and it's just not going to come because it's just a different history. And it's very reminiscent of what historians said in the 1950s about democracy in Germany and Japan, and it's just not going to happen because these countries are just all very different. Which is not to say that I disagree with a lot of the variables you have outlined here. I would just argue, maybe because I come from a related but different discipline, that they matter less over time, and I want to leave it at that because I think we should give the audience some opportunity to engage with us.
Hi, my name is Emily Myers. I'm a Scoville Fellow at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. And as you were talking about the effective strategy being engaging with religious proxies and having sort of a state-religious partnership, I couldn't help but think that requires some level of trust between the two communities, because these religious leaders have to be willing to engage with the state. So if the Kenyan government were to see an incentive to pivot to that sort of strategy, what steps could they take to make that change after decades and decades of a pattern of security abuses and marginalization? I feel it would take a lot for the Kenyan religious communities to be willing to entertain that sort of change. So how do you see the policy evolving if the Kenyan government were to take steps in that direction?
Can I maybe just ask a related, we can take a few, is if religious institutions become too co-opted by the state and too close to the state, they lose their legitimacy with, no, they don't? Okay. Well, they, I think they can. There's a risk of losing your moral standing with the population, and that has happened. And
Where?
Well, over time in Senegal, the Muslim Brotherhoods have had to tread that very fine line between becoming essentially state agents versus maintaining their followers and expressing their grievances, and SUPKEM to extents as well. Okay. Well, okay. So, should we take one more, or should we watch them battle this out on stage? Okay.
Okay. So, yes, I mean, very good point. The question then is, okay, so what can we do now? I still think, and I had that experience in Nairobi and on the coast several times. I mean, it's not the case that there is absolutely no communication between people who are part of Uhuru Kenyatta's Security Council and these mainstream Salafis on the coast. It's not the case that there is absolutely no interaction. And I've had numerous conversations with people who are official or unofficial security advisors to the president. It's impossible for them to get that message across that the Salafi movement is a diverse movement. That's not something the incumbents in Nairobi are willing to spend any time on. And the short and honest answer to this question is, at this stage in time, there doesn't appear to be an opportunity to engage in the creation of mutual trust. That had changed a little during the election, but that had changed a little because Uhuru wanted votes on the coast. And all of a sudden, dialogue was possible, and a lot of title deeds were dished out to those communities that suffer from socioeconomic grievances. That was not really a smart strategy because of a lot of these land title deeds actually had people living on that piece of land. So there are a lot of issues there, but the honest answer is right now, there is no way how this is going to be achieved. And it's going to get much worse once Uhuru is being officially re-elected president of Kenya. That's very clear. At the moment, I do not see a window of opportunity. It will only work if there is much broader cooperation with other influential members of Kenyan civil society. That does take place, for example, the Interreligious Council in Kenya. But it's also internally heavily divided, especially within the Christian community, and different representatives of the Christian community do not look upon Muslims favorably. Let's put it that way. And the main issue here is the evangelical movement. Okay, and many Muslims on the coast are worried about Christian radicalization, which does not manifest itself in violence, but in very abusive preachers and churches. But there has to be a conversation. Right now, there isn't a conversation. So this idea that, if religious people or if religious clerics work with the state, they become illegitimate. I mean, that's not true. Okay. No, it's not.
Nigeria is another example. The whole Izala movement, for example.
What happens in Nigeria where you would say religious leaders have become delegitimized because they talk to government?
It's not talking to government. It's that they're perceived by...
Well, there's nothing... Okay, we can talk for hours about what happens if people are perceived to do certain things. Then that's just it. Because if you think that logically through to the end, then there should be no interaction whatsoever between the religious sphere and government.
No, and I'm not saying just talking. I'm saying engaging and co-opting and being too close to and being essentially agents of the state, the traditional
That's
religious
the risk
hierarchy.
that they will need to take. That is the risk they need to take. If they are unwilling to do this, and if indeed it's true what you are suggesting, that they will automatically lose legitimacy, there is no way out of this dilemma. I want to be very clear about this. And I said this before, those Muslim majority countries in which I've done this kind of research, in which this kind of cooperation agreement takes place, they are visibly doing better in undermining those violent minority groups that resort to violence. I'm not convinced that automatically there is going to be, because this is all based on the assumption.
It's not automatic, but co-option and collusion with an autocratic state
is what happens every day in these countries by a variety of actors. And it's based on the assumption that today, almost 60 years after independence, ordinary African citizens all regard the state as illegitimate, and there is absolutely no evidence for this assumption. you seem to assume that religious followers only have one identity, and that's their religious identity. That's really not the case, and that's not the case in any country in the world. Religious followers are also citizens, and they may regard the state as legitimate or as illegitimate. From survey data, there is very little evidence that indicates that African citizens today regard their states as illegitimate entities.
But if we,
making that kind of a generalization.
if we go back to Subkem, during the era's single-party state, Subkem's relationship with KANU was very close. The leadership of Subkem was dominated by middle-ranking KANU officials, assistant ministers, members of parliament. It may be that Subkem was not an effective intermediary between Kenyan Muslims and the state. I'm willing fully to accept that. But it existed and it performed some kind of role. That intermediary function was destroyed by the advent of multi-party politics. And it was destroyed because Subkem was seen as the voice of KANU rather than as the voice of Kenyan Muslims. And there were breakaway factions, partly because of ideological differences in Islam, but also partly, I would say primarily, because of the identification of Subkem with the ruling party. Subkem lost all of its authority, really, in the early 1990s. You're right to say that Muslims have many identities. And one of those identities is as supporters of a particular political party. And that, too, has confused and compounded the problems of interaction between the Kenyan state and Kenya's Muslim population, particularly those at the coast. On the security issue, about 18 months ago, 23 senior figures from the Kenyan military and security apparatus came here to Washington, and I spent about 5 or 6 hours with them. And I thought, over 5 or 6 hours, we might get a nuanced interpretation of the problems of the coast. And I had a long chat with the deputy head of the National Intelligence Service, whom I thought would understand the social and economic grievances at the coast. And the message, loud and clear, was this is not a social and economic issue. This is a security issue, purely and simply. We will not countenance the idea that the coast is more deprived than other parts of Kenya. And try as I might to shift their minds, I got absolutely nowhere. We had this total response. And I think that is the way that the Kenyan government perceives the issue. It is a security issue. And partly the United States is to blame. Because after 9/11, when the FBI went into coastal Kenya, that was the message they conveyed. And it was only perhaps after the beginning of the Obama administration that the United States began to shift its position and to acknowledge the real problems at the coast and try to get the Kenyan government to perceive them. But as far as I can see, it has made absolutely no progress. And Sebastian is right to say many Christians, upcountry Kenya, are profoundly suspicious of Islam. I remember 2007 and the hullabaloo that was created around the myth that Raila had supposedly endorsed the imposition of the Sharia at the coast. There was a big fuss in 2010 over the role of the Qadi courts over Muslim family law and inheritance, although the 2010 Constitution merely reiterated what was in the 1963 Constitution, which merely reiterated the regulations that had been followed by the British colonial regime. And when Sebastian talks about evangelical Christianity, as though that is a new force in Kenya, evangelical Christianity is and has always been the dominant expression of religious belief among Protestants in Kenya. And therefore, it seems to me that we have a society which has very deep and profound suspicion of what happens down there at the coast, and even more suspicion of what happens in northeastern province. It's not just the government, it's many, many ordinary Kenyans.
Yes, Ambassador.
Thanks for great presentations. I was U.S. Ambassador to Uganda from 2002 to 2005, and you've connected a lot of dots of things that make them clearer. But you haven't touched at all on the examples of sort of international terrorism that took place in East Africa. Certainly we in Uganda were looking at the evidence, thinking there had been discussions of the Nairobi and Dar es Salaam bombings also being directed at the embassy in Uganda. It was not. What were the reasons for that? A little bit of self-satisfaction, maybe it was the domestic atmosphere, and then there was the World Cup bombing clearly directed at foreigners from people not really from the indigenous Ugandan historic communities, and then the Westlands and university bombings and attacks in Kenya, which also seemed to be directed not against the authorities in the country, nor having much to do with the internal dynamics of the Muslim populations there. I'd just like you to put those incidents in context and see if there's something we can do to prevent recurrences of those sorts of attacks.
Thank you. With regard to your question, I guess that's my weak spot, because my research really focused almost exclusively on sort of domestic relationships as they occur between religious communities and the state. I think from what I've heard from people who previously were members of the ADF and who were involved in terrorist attacks and who may have access to these networks that you just referred to, networks that were responsible for the World Cup bombing, and those networks that were responsible for the bombings of the US Embassy in Tanzania and Kenya. These forces are still operating in Uganda. There were even people who told me that some groups of Boko Haram are operating in Uganda, but again, it's difficult for them to recruit because of the presence of the Ugandan state. I don't know much more about this, but these networks that stage these attacks are still very present, and I would assume that's the case in Kenya, or they're even more present in Kenya.
If we talk about the bombing of the embassy in Kenya, the bombing of the Israeli hotel in Mombasa, the attempt to shoot down the El Al plane, and then Westgate, and the role of Al-Qaeda, Al-Hijra in Kenya. I think the tale is that there was a clear terrorist cell established as early as 1993 and was funded by the creation of two Muslim NGOs and frequent contact between Nairobi, Khartoum, and Mogadishu, using the aeroplanes transporting cat into Somalia. And that's one of the reasons why the Kenyan government is so profoundly suspicious of Muslim NGOs. We've had the recent fracas over Muhuri, Muslims for Human Rights, of Haki Africa, organizations which have been critical of the anti-terrorism police. And that dates back to the Help Africa People, the Mercy International Relief Agency of the early 1990s, which were really Al-Qaeda fronts financing terrorism in Kenya. Abu Rogo Mohammed, I think, is a very interesting individual. He was an IPK guy in Mombasa. In 1992, he ran as a Ford Kenya candidate for the Mombasa City Council. And he was a key figure in the establishment of ties between Kenyan jihadis and Al-Qaeda. He came from Siu in the north of Lamu, moved to Nairobi, to Mombasa in '89. He was an activist at the Congo Mosque in Likoni, and he helped put together the Kenyan side of the attack on the US Embassy in 1998. He then ran his own madrasa in Mombasa, which was a cover for the recruitment of Al-Shabaab operators. I've seen figures suggesting that of the foreigners operating in Somalia for Al-Shabaab, 25% of them are Kenyan recruits. So you have very, very close ties. And there were, by 2012, bomb attacks against evangelical churches, and eventually the Kenyan police shot him. They took him out in August 2012, which ignited 2 days of rioting in Mombasa. 2,000 people were injured, major demonstrations in the Majengo and around the Musa Mosque. So that there is an active jihadi faction in Kenya of indigenous Kenyans. That was proved in Mpeketoni. I think that was true of the Westgate attacks. And I think that fits into the politics of Al-Shabaab in Somalia, that there was, between 2010, 2013, a big internal power struggle in Al-Shabaab, a big internal debate over what strategy should be pursued to most effectively improve their position in Somalia. And one faction argued that this was a purely Somali struggle. The other faction argued that the greatest achievement could be made by destabilizing Kenya, destabilizing Uganda, make participation in AMISOM no longer tenable. And the best way to bring about success for Al-Shabaab in Somalia was to launch attacks in Mombasa and Nairobi and Kampala. And that seems to me a very, very sensible strategy. If I were the leader of Al-Shabaab, I would target a number of shopping malls in Nairobi again. Particularly ones close to the United States Embassy and UN compound. It would not take much to destroy the Kenyan economy. It's pretty precarious. And a number of carefully targeted attacks on primarily Western targets or partially Western targets in Nairobi would have very, very damaging consequences for the Kenyan economy. And if I were Al-Shabaab, I'd have done it long ago. It seems a very, very sensible strategy to pursue.
But if you were trying to deter them, what would you say?
If I were trying to deter them, I would say it's virtually impossible.
Yeah, just to build on some of the things that David said, those were incredibly important points. Al-Shabaab has long become a domestic Kenyan force. And there have been numerous reports, both by academics as well as by the United Nations, which show that what originally started as an attempt to recruit Kenyans coming to Somalia and then later stage attacks in Kenya has now really become a jihadi force on its own operating in Kenya. And I was struck when I was in Nairobi that, you know, you land in Nairobi and there are a lot of pictures being taken of you, right? Because there are cameras everywhere. But security in these shopping malls and in these strategic locations are surprisingly lax, okay? There are controls, but if you wanted to plan an attack, it probably wouldn't be all that difficult. And to be honest, I am somewhat surprised that not more is happening.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Rachel. I'm with the Department of Homeland Security. And just to bring this back to the national security aspect that you had mentioned, I understand that there's a lot of mistrust between, you know, the coastal communities and the Kenyan government. But with this national security aspect, has the Kenyan government tried to make any inroads with local community leaders, because they're the people who are going to be seeing the indicators of radicalization?
Thank you very much. Eric Robinson, National Endowment for Democracy, Africa Program. Both your presentations were fantastic. I could have listened to each of you for another hour, very illuminating. One of your points, Sebastian, toward the end, when you talked about cooperating and co-opting, it caused me to think of a question similar to Jennifer's, and in your response to her, I'm not sure, it must be some other academic time continuum that you're bothered about that jumped into this one. I'm not sure where you made that causal leap to it being illegitimate. I think her point was, and my point is, when you want to work with and co-opt people, that's fantastic. If it works, that's great, but you also have to have something else behind it. As David pointed out, people ultimately are looking for something to be delivered. They either want to be recognized as part of the polity, as mattering, or they want some socioeconomic development and benefit. So if, whether it's in the Kenyan government and the coast, or if it's in Somalia, you can bring people in, but unless that turns around and becomes some benefit to the society, what you're going to do is you're going to create radicalization of those people who are also part of the religious community that say they're sellouts, and you're just going to deepen and continue the cycle of radicalization. So what happens after you reach out, you begin to cooperate, then what are the deliverables after that point?
For that gallant defense.
Okay, so I'm sorry if that was a bit over the top. Okay. So cooperation, and I totally agree with the point you just made. So obviously the best strategy is cooperation. Okay. And I totally agree with you. If this is supposed to be meaningful, there has to be a linkage not just between government and religious leaders, but between religious leaders and their followers, because there is no point in co-opting weak religious leaders. That's very clear. What has delegitimized groups like the CIPK in Kenya is their cooperation with US aid and their involvement in the aid industry. It's what has not, that they were reaching out to the Kenyan government has not delegitimized them. And there is a difference of whether you cooperate with foreign powers, ordinary Muslim citizens regard as alien to their interest, or whether you work with your own government. The question of co-optation is a complicated one, but the consequences of co-optation gone sour, to me, from what I've observed in those 6 African countries, are much less detrimental than the consequences of non-consultation and indiscriminate violence. And I'm not advocating the co-optation of religious leaders. What I'm saying is this concern about these leaders becoming illegitimate in the eyes of their followers, to me, strikes me as less relevant in the countries where I've been to than the consequences of just ignoring them, not engaging with them, or just hitting people with a stick. And there is a trade-off here. Okay, ultimately, if we believe in the utility of external interventions, we have to be brave enough and say, well, maybe that will delegitimize these people in the process. And I'm not ruling this out. But I'm saying taking this risk is probably better than just saying, oh, well, it's history. You know, it's always been like this. And by the way, David, I'm not really sure what the policy implications are from an argument that says, well, it's just history. It's just always been like that. Okay.
I'm not sure I said that. You know, I did say we need to grapple with the real economic and social grievances of the coast. Well, and that is what is fueling Jihadi Islam in Kenya, rather than the fact that SUPKEM doesn't operate as an effective organization of policing and controlling Islam. It strikes me that, you know, SUPKEM is a mere epiphenomenon. It's irrelevant. And what we have to deal with are the social grievances and problems, and the way of policing Salafi Islam. I really cannot perceive it as being a particularly significant factor. I would say, although I recognize the danger of them being perceived as American-sponsored institutions, that one of the things that the Kenyan government could do would be to stop beating up Muhuri and Haki Africa, that actually work with these organizations to monitor what is going on in Kenyan society and to monitor the aberrant behavior of the anti-terrorist police and other institutions of the Kenyan state. But you know, I am nervous that they are so dependent upon American funding and support from institutions like the Open Society. I also think that, you know, the Kenyan government has a basic problem. It doesn't like NGOs, because NGOs back in 2007 made the mistake of being so virulently in support of Raila Odinga. To a certain extent, we're reliving that. And ever since then, a decade now, the Kenyan government has paid very little attention to domestic NGOs, and particularly domestic human rights NGOs. And I see no evidence that that is going to change. You know, then what's going to happen next week, I think, will maybe merely confirm their animosity and suspicion. And I think the Kenyan NGOs have played their relationship with the Kenyan government excruciatingly incompetently. So that really they exert very little influence on the Kenyan government. I'd say virtually no influence on the Kenyan government. And that seems to me a tragedy. That relationship needs to be rebuilt. But the rebuilding of that relationship with Muslim NGOs is even more problematic given the relationship that some of them had with Al-Qaeda back in the 1990s.
We are at time, I'm afraid, but come up afterwards. I want to thank both Sebastian and David really for fascinating. Again, I find that the history fascinating. I think the disagreements are illuminating. I will say I just came back from Burkina Faso for the second tranche of our project, and I think out of a intense sensitivity about the secular nature of the state, the Burkinabe government is very reluctant to engage kind of in the religious realm and engage religious leaders. I think there is a good way and a very positive way of doing that, but there are leaders who fear kind of jumping into that sensitive or restricting freedoms or being perceived as restricting freedoms. So Burkina would be a very interesting case to follow as well. Listen, thank you both again. Thank you all for joining us, and stick around to ask questions.